if Putin's position starts to look shaky, and indeed it looks as if there may be some kind of transfer of power, I think someone like Karalyov is likely to be making cost-benefit analyses as to quite who he should be supporting or not. We saw this to a degree with the Wagner mutiny last year. So it'll be an interesting sign of the future. And it's one of the ways in which the Putin state looks very, very solid and powerful at the moment, but actually has some very deep cracks within it. Sergei Beseda is actually one of the more interesting and in some ways now, certainly in the West, notorious figures within the FSB, Russia's internal security force, in that he heads the fifth section, which has this rather sort of benign title of the sort of International Connections Agency. But in practice, what this means is it also acts as a foreign intelligence service within the countries immediately adjoining Russia that were part of the Soviet Union. And that obviously means, for the moment, especially Ukraine. So Beseda was regarded as one of the prime movers behind the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 because he basically sold the idea to Putin that he had this extraordinary network of agents all across Ukraine that were just waiting for the moment to declare their support for Moscow. Of course, what happened is most of these people either were just simply taking Moscow's money or were essentially corrupt figures who didn't exist in the first place. So he's very much regarded as one of the key figures behind the massive blunder of the initial invasion, but he seemed to, for a long time, have got away with that. It's easy to assume that Beseda now leaving is because of some kind of conspiracy or because Putin is angry with him. But then, let's be honest, if Putin were angry with him, then, well, you don't wait more than 2 years to actually express that anger. Beseda has reached the age of 70, which is the technical maximum age to be working within the Russian state. Now, in theory, you can get a presidential decree to allow you to stay on. In fact, a lot of other senior figures within the FSB do. But either Beseda didn't want to, or else there was a sense that he'd kind of outlived his shelf life. And therefore, he's now retiring. But even so, I mean, he's clearly not being pushed out into the outer dark. He's still technically an advisor to the director of the FSB, so he's still sort of somewhere around, at least given that kind of honorific sinecure. What's really quite striking is that the FSB generally, which was Putin's old service, he was for 1 year director of it before he was prime minister and then president, and is in many ways the main inheritor of the old Soviet KGB, which again Putin served in, actually has not taken any real damage as a result of the massive blunders we've seen in recent years. Beseda, after all, was not in any ways some kind of friend of Putin's or crony of Putin's. They had no personal connection really there. It's just more generally that Putin seems continued to be willing to give the FSB always, not just the benefit of the doubt, but basically a pass. And that has dramatically undermined his own efforts in Ukraine and elsewhere. But there you go, that's Putin's own decision-making. If we really start to dig into kind of what we might think of as Russian spookology, it's really quite striking who has actually replaced Beseda, in that it's a man by the name of Alexei Komkov, who is not exactly going to be a household name. He's former head of the Economic Security Service, which incidentally is generally regarded as being the most corrupt part of the FSB. You know, it's in the Economic Security Service that you really make your money, by basically being the protection racketeer's protection racketeer. But the main thing about Komkov is rather that he's very much seen as a client of the current first deputy director of the FSB, a man by the name of Sergei Karalyov, who for years has been essentially the heir apparent to take over the FSB after the current head. But for years, because of bad luck and general developments, and also the fact that there's a strong keep Karalyov out sort of faction within the FSB, has not been able to sort of grab his real prize. Beseda was definitely not a fan of Karalyov's. So with him shuffling off into retirement and Komkov coming into his very powerful place, it very much seems like we're going to have to get used to the fact that there will be a new head of the FSB, which may not sound as if it matters to us, but actually will have an impact on us and the policies we have to face. Look, at the best of times, senior level Russian politics is a snake pit of rival factions and individuals all duking it out. The FSB in particular, there's been some really strong rivalries. First of all, simply because of the economic opportunities. And frankly, a corrupt FSB officer lives very, very well indeed. Secondly, it's because of the political opportunities. This is a powerful institution which has quite a role in helping sort of shape how Putin sees the world and therefore what policies get adopted. So, for all these reasons, it really it is a very severe issue, that the degree to which we actually have infighting, not to the level of people killing other people, let's say, but certainly in the level of people actually making sure that their clients win out in struggles and other people's sort of cronies and subordinates get pushed out of the system. I've long been worried about the prospect of what happens if Korolyov becomes director of the FSB. Look, the current director, Alexander Bortnikov, he's 73 years old. He's been ill for quite some years. He's seems to be a relatively competent official, even though he's not really been able to get much of a grip on the FSB senior leadership for years now. The point is, for a long time, he was always going to be on the verge of retiring. Back in 2021, Sergei Korolyov was about to take over. Then a scandal slightly sort of derailed it. And then there was the war. And obviously Putin was unhappy with the idea of shifting security chiefs during the war and so forth. And why this has been in some ways, I would say, a good thing is because, unlike Bortnikov, Sergei Korolyov, whose very little is known about him, the only photo we have is from over 10 years ago. But anyway, Sergei Korolyov has, according to insiders whom I've spoken to, a reputation for being smart, ruthless, pretty dirty. He's been in bed with organized crime figures and such like, metaphorically. But more to the point, very active. And I think this is the concern, because quite frankly, what we would, and I imagine what many Russians would like, is in fact a lazy and inefficient head of the FSB. This time they're going to get someone who's much younger and who frankly has something more to prove. Bortnikov, the old head, is someone whom Putin knows. He's safe in Putin's good books. Korolyov, particularly because of the number of critics he's got, will be someone who definitely has to show the boss that he has what it takes. And therefore, I think if Korolyov takes over, we're going to see a renewed crackdown within Russia. And we're also going to see the FSB continue its attempt to move into foreign intelligence and subversion operations in the West as well. So we can expect a much sharper edge to the FSB if he takes over. The boundaries between Russian politics, business, and organised crime have always been pretty hazy. Now, we should be clear about this. Organised crime is much less powerful in Russia today than it was, say, in the 1990s, which is a period of anarchic and violent free-for-all. Very much Putin has established that the state is ultimately the biggest gang in town. And so relationship with the organised crime, sometimes people call this, sort of a mafia state. I don't like that characterization because it implies either the Kremlin runs organised crime or organised crime runs the Kremlin. And that's not the case. But what they have are this wonderful Russian word, понятия, understandings. There are understandings between the state and organised crime. And what this tends to mean is that a lot of officials, from Putin downwards, have at different times in their careers had dealings with gangsters. If one looks at Putin's career in the 1990s in St. Petersburg, he was essentially liaising between the city government and the local organised crime figures and making a lot of money for himself out of the process. So what we have is exactly a situation where the most powerful figures, the most powerful dirty figures, shall we say, in Russia, are absolutely corrupt officials. But there are some things that they want doing, whether it's smuggling very highly demanded, but now sanction-controlled consumer goods into Russia, or carrying out operations outside Russia, for which they need the gangsters. And therefore, they reach deals. And that, I think, is something that, unfortunately, is becoming more and more important as Russia becomes more of a state-controlled kind of war-fighting nation. And it's definitely something that the people like Korolyov will bring to the absolute top of the security apparatus. Putin's Russia is increasingly becoming a gerontocracy run by basically 70-plus-year-olds. He's 71. Current head of the FSB is 73. His recently sort of transferred Security Council chief was 72 years old. These are people whom Putin knows. They're his generation. Most of them are ex-KGB. Many of them come from St. Petersburg. But the point is, they are all of the same generation and therefore have a very similar mindset. It's increasingly clear that although Putin is trying to hold on to these cronies of his, he is going to have to give more and more key positions to the next political generation down, of whom Korolyov is a representative. And the interesting thing is these are different. They're not nice people, but on the whole, they are ruthless, opportunistic, self-interested kleptocrats who want to basically steal and then enjoy the proceeds of that theft. They're not interested necessarily in some kind of grand ideological campaign against the West. So we may well see that these kleptocrats actually will be, ironically enough, pushing for better relations with the West purely because if you've stolen so much, you want to be able to enjoy it fully. But it also means these are people who don't have those kind of primal gut senses of loyalty to Putin. These are not people who have spent the last 30 years socializing with him and so forth. So with someone like Karalyov, my view is that so long as Putin is solidly in power, Karalyov will be a ruthless and effective guarantor of Putin's position. But on the other hand, if Putin's position starts to look shaky, and indeed it looks as if there may be some kind of transfer of power, I think someone like Karalyov is likely to be making cost-benefit analyses as to quite who he should be supporting or not. We saw this to a degree with the Wagner mutiny last year. So it'll be an interesting sign of the future. And it's one of the ways in which the Putin state looks very, very solid and powerful at the moment, but actually has some very deep cracks within it.